Henna Inam, welcome to the Partnering Leadership Podcast.
Thank you, Mahan. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
I'm really excited because I had read Wired for Authenticity. We'll talk a little bit about that. Spend most of our time today talking about Wired for Disruption, which I think is fabulous. I love your podcast also, which I think is of tremendous value. So this is a conversation that could take hours. I'll try to capture half an hour of it and send people to your podcast, your books, because I think they're all brilliant insights and I really appreciate them.
Oh, thank you. I really look forward to connecting with your podcast listeners.
So, Hannah, I find you have a fascinating story of your own. So, can you share with our audience a little bit about your upbringing that impacted the kind of leader you became?
Wow, that's like such a big question, right? um, well, I am originally from Pakistan. So I always sort of start there so people get a sense of the fact that I'm a bit of a global citizen. We left my birthplace for my dad's job. And then we lived between the ages of about 11 to 20, we lived all over the world. Every 2 or 3 years, we lived in East Africa, in Tanzania, in the Philippines, in Thailand, and then we landed in Texas. So I would say that a lot of my leadership journey, as you know, so much of our who we become as leaders and who we become as human beings is shaped by our growing up experiences. And I would say a lot of my growing up experiences have been about how do I become agile and fit into a new school, a new culture, a new language every 2 or 3 years. And it's created a tremendous curiosity in me and a sense of adventure and also a sense of finding what's good and right here rather than lamenting about what could be.
And that's fabulous. And I think that's part of what has helped you think through the disruptions that we've been facing. Now, before the book on disruption, you obviously wrote about authenticity and authentic leadership. What in you made you focus on authenticity and authentic leadership?
Yeah, it's such a good question because so after my schooling, I went to undergrad in Texas, and then went to grad school at Wharton, and then worked 20 years in corporate America, first with Procter and Gamble, and then with Novartis, and always, it was sort of replaying my corporate career was sort of replaying my growing up experiences every 2 or 3 years, a new challenge, a new opportunity, and I kind of found myself at the age of 40 with a midlife crisis where, up to that point, Mahan, I had a sense that my road to happiness is about, one achievement and then the next achievement and then the next achievement. And I found myself, ironically, at that point when I turned 40, I was one of 10 people out of 90,000 employees that year that our CEO of Novartis recognized for outstanding business results, myself and my team. And I remember taking that flight from Basel, Switzerland, which is where they had this big event every year, back to Mexico City, which is where I was based. Our business was based at the time, and thinking I should really be happy. I'm kind of at the height of my career here, and I'm feeling like something is missing. And so with that, and maybe it was just about turning 40, I don't know, I started asking some of the big questions, right, around what makes one not just happy, but really fulfilled in life. And I realized that it wasn't one achievement, but it was a sense of pursuing something deeper in the sense of purpose. And so pretty much soon after that assignment, I got promoted out of a GM job in Mexico to running the Americas in a different division. So I was president of North and South America. And during all of that time, I had kind of this thought in the back of my head, like, I know there's something else, and I don't know what that is. And so right around that time, that movie Eat, Pray, Love had just come out. And so I sort of fashioned myself, this Julia Roberts character. And I thought, I'm going to go figure out, what is fulfillment. And so I went off to an ashram in India. I learned how to meditate, 20 days of that experience. And I think learned mindfulness. And I think that's coming back to your question, Mahan. I think that is what started this sense of what is authenticity? Who are we really? Why are we here? And for me personally, it was a really gratifying experience, because what it led me to do is eventually leave my corporate career. And 4 years after that trip, I decided that I was ready to leave and really pursue something that felt more like a legacy for me. And it was all about, for me, it's all about how can we find our deepest and most authentic selves and use that to be a force for good in today's times.
And that is magnificent to hear, Henna. And one of the reasons I asked you about that is because, as I said, it's a brilliant book. It's a great book. And I see it almost as a primer also to being able to handle disruption well. You do go into some aspects of it in Wired for Disruption, but knowing ourselves and becoming our authentic selves is really important. Before then, we can deal with those external disruptors.
Absolutely. That is so, so true. I really feel that the more grounded that we are in our core, in our authentic selves, the more we're actually able to be flexible to the outside world, because we know that there is something, a sense of purpose, a sense of values that really ground and anchor us.
Yes. Now, with respect to disruption, a lot of people have been talking about the pandemic and that crisis, but the reality is the pace of disruption has been picking up over the years, and it has nothing to do with the pandemic itself. So you have a positive take on it, even with the title. You say we are wired for disruption.
Yeah. So I really do have an optimistic take on it. And I really believe, and maybe it was from my upbringing, right? This sense of optimism about life, that life throws us into experiences that are intended to grow us, that are intended for our evolution for the better, I believe. And I think that in particular, this disruption that we're facing with the pandemic is giving all of us, I think, the opportunity to pause and discover what's really important. And I think that many of us are doing that work. I know for myself, early on in the pandemic, my work was very quickly around, well, how can I contribute, in this time? What strengths do I have? How do I bring my sense of purpose to this time? And what does the world need from me? And I think as disruption happens, the more we can ask those questions. What are my superpowers? What does the world need from me in this time? And who am I most inspired to serve? I think those questions help us be more grounded in times of disruption. And truly, I really believe that when we are focused on those questions and living our life from those questions, rather than living our life from the perspective of anxiety or fear or, gosh, what's going to happen, I think that we are able to be a force for good. And indeed, actually, it's good for our neurobiology.
And you mentioned that we do also need to be agile, which is a big part of obviously your book. How do you define agility before we get to the 5 different types that you say we have to be able to take advantage of being wired for disruption?
Yeah, so agility is simply our ability to be flexible, right? It's our ability to shift, whether it's our perspective and how we see things, to shifting our ability to our internal state of being, our attitudes, our neurobiology, if you will. It's also our ability to shift our behaviors. But, all of the research suggests that our behaviors come from mindsets And in fact, they actually come from also from our state of being. And so the more that we can see differently and then act differently, the greater the chances that we have a more positive outcome in the world. And honestly, I'll tell you, Mahan, one of the things that really inspired the book was my time at the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year. And I had the experience to be part of a virtual reality experience where I was a tree, and you put your headsets on, and you're handed a little seed, and I experienced what it's like to be a tree in the Amazon rainforest. And I thought, what a cool experience is this? Because I am a bit of a tree hugger myself, and this technology is truly amazing. I remember just kind of standing there and actually feeling like I'm growing from a little sprout to a long, tall tree. And then I had this almost like this, what's the best way to describe it? This little, almost like this bird that landed on my arm, and I could feel something landing on my arm. And it was a beautiful, rainforest parrot. And I thought, well, how beautiful is this? And eventually, and I won't get into a lot of details on this, but I experienced being burned down.
Wow.
As a tree. And I literally walked out with tears in my eyes. That's how visceral the experience was for me. And I thought to myself later that evening, what am I doing to help this world be more sustainable? And what do I have to offer? And I literally had a knot in my stomach, like, this is something I need to do something about. So that was in January of 2020. March, the pandemic happened, and I thought, okay, here's an opportunity where I can leverage what I have to offer, which is my writing ability and my ability to see leadership and access to wonderful thought leaders and sharing their thinking. And so that's what started this book, Wired for Disruption.
And what a beautiful example, Henna, of empathy. And in this case, empathy for what a tree would go through. Obviously, the experience allowed you to see that, feel that, experience it, and relate to it. Now, you have brilliant advice to leaders, and you talk about the 5 different types of agility that we need to have, starting out with neuro-emotional agility. What is that?
Yeah, so neuro-emotional agility is the ability to shift ourselves. So anytime any disruption happens, and by the way, as you and I have spoken, right, even after we found a vaccine and we've been able to overcome this issue of the pandemic, disruption, whether that is climate disruption or organizational disruption, disruption will continue to be in our lives. And anytime disruption happens, it creates a sense of fear and anxiety. It's actually well researched through the Kubler-Ross change curve. Like our experience, we go through a series of emotions, and it's not until we're actually able to integrate this disruption in terms of finding meaning in it that our performance rises. And so, as many of us have experienced this, this year, through these last few months, we experience a lot of mental issues, right? We've experienced a lot of mental challenges. And so how do we, whether it's for ourselves or for the people that we lead, how are we able to quickly switch ourselves from a state of fear or anxiety to a state of purpose, to a state of creativity, to a state of curiosity, to a state of connectedness, and a state of empathy? And so that's neuro-emotional agility. It's the ability to take ourselves from this place, which is very normal. It's part of our regular human experience, to a different place. And as you said, one of the things you pointed to is empathy. Empathy, that using and activating the empathic neural networks in our body, in our brain, actually helps us move to these other states that are much more creative and curious, which is what we and our teams need in order to respond to what's happening, the challenges of the day.
And it is very hard for us to do that with ourselves, have that empathy for ourselves and that emotional agility for ourselves. But I find it's becoming harder for leaders to be able to show that to their team members. At the beginning of the crisis, there was a burst of empathy. And because of that, a lot of employee engagement numbers went up. But there's been a struggle as the disruption has continued and with more disruptions to continue doing that. So, what advice would you have for leaders, which is the primary audience of this podcast, on how they can embrace neuro-emotional agility with their teams, not just for themselves?
Yeah. So we all have mirror neurons in our brains, right? Mirror neurons are our empathy system, where we can feel the other emotion, the emotions of others, and they're actually contagious, right? So we've all experienced when somebody is, particularly somebody who is in a higher level in the hierarchy, who has a lot of power, um, is in a team, it has certain emotions, whether that's stress, it spreads like wildfire, right, on the team. And or on the other hand, if somebody at the very top is very calm, it also helps to calm the team down. And so that's our mirror neurons. And so coming back to your question, how do we really sustain empathy? How do we continue to grow our neuro emotional agility muscle? And by the way, we have it, right? Because, and that's why I said we're wired for it. We're wired for it because everybody has these mirror neurons. And what we have is these muscles, and they just need to be trained. So we all have these empathy muscles. One of the greatest pieces of research, and in fact, it's one of the podcast episodes on my podcast, is on compassion. And the researcher, her name is Kristen Neff, she's out of the University of Texas, who talked about 2,600 studies being done on self-compassion. Well, one of the most important pieces of data that she shared is that in all of the research, that when we actually practice self-compassion for ourselves, it actually helps us extend compassion for others. So you talked about we feel kind of burned out early on. We're sort of, everybody's sort of coming together to say, how do we help each other? But as we get worn down, and so the more we can practice self-compassion, the research would suggest the greater our capacity to sustain compassion for others.
That's brilliant advice, Henna. And that's the first agility. You also mentioned learning agility, which has been important over the decades. Whether Drucker was talking about it, Tom Peters talked about it, but it seems like the pace of change is picking up. So learning agility needs to pick up too.
Yeah, yeah. So learning agility is the ability to learn, to unlearn, and then to relearn. And what I would say probably the most important aspect that we need to pay attention to is the unlearning aspect of it, because there is so much that the human brain receives that over time it's overwhelming. And so our brain, through our evolution, created shortcuts so that so much of our calories, I think it's like 25 to 30% of our calories go into our brain's operating system. And so over time, the brain developed, and this is kind of the old days when we didn't have the McDonald's, dollar meals. Our brains basically decided that the way to evolve and we need to conserve calories is to create shortcuts. And so those shortcuts, our ability to unlearn, is actually quite challenging because we're oftentimes not even aware of our biases and shortcuts. So if the world that we used to live in was much more predictable, that shortcut worked. But in a world that is less predictable, where there are no consultants and or experts necessarily to go to find the right answer, or a book to read the right answer in, what we need to do is become much more curious, much more mindful of our own biases, and much more in a state of doing experiments which, by the way, if we have a bias for fear of failure, which, all of our corporate lives, many of us who've gone through corporate lives, there's a fear of failure. And so how do we, from an organizational culture perspective, from a leadership perspective, create cultures where we unlearn those leadership behaviors that used to serve us, but no longer serve us?
And I love in the book, you say, as the future is unpredictable, we create the future by learning in the present moment.
That is so true in the research. I mean, one of the things that that I believe is hugely powerful as a tool for each of us as we go forward. And believe me, Mahan, if I had a magic wand and I could do one thing, I would ask that everybody develop a mindfulness practice, because it is about being in the present moment here and observing, not through the filters of our biases, but through clear lenses, what is happening here and how do I need to adapt?
Yes, that's fabulous. And you also move on to the importance of trust and trust agility. There's another brilliant thinker, Rishad Tubakawala, says trust is speed in organizations. So what do you mean when you talk about trust agility?
Yeah, I think that quote that you just mentioned is so powerful, because there is research that suggests that teams that have trust are 9 times more agile. And trust agility is the ability to rapidly establish trust. We're now working in virtual environments. We're working on teams that, many of the pandemic teams sort of just came together, people who hadn't, necessarily worked in the old organization structures before together. And so I think more and more organizations will figure out how to create organizational structures that are much more agile. So teams come together to solve problems and then dissipate, and then they come together to solve other problems. And so how do you quickly establish trust on those teams? We're often working multi-generationally, right? We're often working across the globe in different time zones. And so how do you learn how to create that level of trust? And oftentimes, Mahan, one thing that I know is a barrier to trust is stress, right? And disruption creates a lot of stress. So we almost have to double down our effort to create trust and to be trustworthy and trust first, in order to be able to have that kind of level of agility and speed.
And that's really important. I want to underline the point that you make here, Henna, in that I used to make fun of trust falls and those other exercises, that it might make you trust the person to fall back in their arms. That doesn't mean when you go back in the work environment, you trust them in the work environment. So the points that you're making, and you made in the book also, help people trust in a professional work environment, not just gimmicks meant at trying to advance trust. So you also mentioned stakeholder agility that has become a lot more important. I think I've heard the term stakeholder, or a version of that, more over the past few years than ever before. What is stakeholder agility, and why do you think that's important for leaders?
Yeah. So you've heard of the Business Roundtable. It's a group of the largest companies in the United States, CEOs that have come together, I believe it was last year in 2019, in August of 2019, and said, the purpose of business is no longer just to serve shareholders. The purpose of business is to serve all stakeholders. And indeed, that's what makes business sustainable over the long term. And so for me, stakeholder agility is this ability to notice the entire ecosystem that you are part of, and the fact that no one person does anything alone. And in fact, we know that whether it's climate change or the pandemic, or even some of the issues around racial injustice that we are trying to solve for in the world, that we are so interconnected that that issues can only be solved for through a view of the entire ecosystem, and working with different ecosystem partners rather than trying to think in silos. And so how do we create that ability to understand, empathize with, and manage the needs of all the stakeholders in our ecosystem so that together we're partnering to solve larger ecosystem issues. And that requires a different way of leading, not the hierarchical way of leading where, you know, we're kind of at the center of decision making, but a much more collaborative and partnership and empathetic way of leading.
Absolutely. And even here in the region, in the Greater Washington region, we are focusing a lot of effort on that because it is important to be able to solve those broader system-wide issues. It requires a different kind of thinking. That's why I love your quote. We are increasingly solving problems that require shared ownership and shared action.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's so many amazing people doing work, really good work in this area. And I'd say one of the great examples to me of stakeholder agility, and there's many, is the CEO of Marriott. There's a really famous clip, and I'd encourage your listeners to go watch it, of him talking about, you know, how he's having to lay people off as a result of, or furlough people as a result of what's happened. And the level of empathy that you feel, where he feels a personal sense of responsibility to his people. I think that's a brilliant example of stakeholder agility in action.
Yes, yes, it is. And we are fortunate to have Marriott as one of our big corporate citizens in this region. And they are great in other aspects of stakeholder agility also. And then the final agility you mentioned is growth agility.
Yeah, so that's, you know, we have, the way I see it, we have 10 years. And as I said, I'm a bit of a tree hugger, right? I see that we have 10 years, you know, to really solve the climate issue. And no one of us is going to do it on their own. It will require shared ownership and shared action. And in order for us to shift our mindsets toward collective problem solving, it will require a shift in us, right? In our ability, each one of us, in our ability to discover the purposes that matter most to us, join force with others to make an impact in those purposes, and do the best that we can. And you know, it could be anything, really. It's just whatever you feel most called to. And so from that perspective, I think growth agility is really the sense of how do we grow ourselves individually within ourselves, and then how do we grow each other? Because this growth, this planet needs people to grow at a really rapid scale. Their level of consciousness around shared ownership of the planet. And so how do we do that collectively so that it's not just, you know, the people at the very top that are being grown, it's everybody on a team grows everybody else.
That's fabulous. And again, you provide a great framework for individuals, leaders, and organizations to embrace this agility. And you mention in the dedication of the book that disruption is hard, but full of opportunity. So I'm curious to hear your perspectives. What are the opportunities you see ahead for us as leaders, organizations, and as a society as we move forward?
I see, I see a very bright future ahead of us. I see leaders stepping up. You know, I think Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, you know, the largest money manager, when he says climate risk is business risk, he he is one of those people that has the ability to have influence and move an ecosystem. Fortune just came out with their 50 most powerful women's list. This year, for the first time, they added a criteria, not just in terms of what's the size of business and influence that this woman has, but are they a force for good or not? And so I think this year in 2020 is a year of waking us all up. Yes, it's really hard. Yes, there has been an incredible amount of suffering, but just think about it, Mahan. We don't really pay attention sometimes until something hurts. And when something hurts, that's when it catches our attention. If we stub our toe, right, we give it some attention. And so I think, in my view, while the pandemic has been really hard, it's also tremendously fruitful if we choose to wake up as a human species and as individuals to figure out what is it that I'm called to and how can I be a force for good. We only really have 10 years.
Well, you have given us the framework for leading that way, both for ourselves and our organizations. This is just the beginning of the conversation, Henna. I would like to see, where do you want the audience to seek out more information about you, your wonderful podcast, your books, resources?
Yeah, so I would point. The podcast is great because it's live, right? And every episode, I talk to leaders who are being a force for good and are embodying some of the principles of agility that I talk about in the book. So definitely reach out. The podcast is called the Transformational Leadership Podcast with Henna Inam. And I really truly believe, for me, my mission is to help support your development as a transformational leader. So, if this is something that intrigues you, please reach out, listen to the podcast, connect with me on LinkedIn. Certainly, you can buy the book. There's an online free assessment that you can do to figure out where you are in these 5 types of agility. And so that is on my website. And Mahan, I'll just ask for you to link into the show notes. That. And I really look forward to connecting with people who want to be a force for good and believe that there are collective problems that they want to help solve for.
Well, we will absolutely link to all those resources in the show notes, Henna. I highly recommend the books, Wired for Authenticity, Wired for Disruption. Love both of those. And your podcast is the first one I listen to when it comes out. I absolutely love those conversations. My favorite still is Richard Boyatzis. I think that was
It's
a
great.
brilliant conversation. But there is a lot to learn, to grow. And thank you for all you have done to energize leaders to make the difference in our communities, in our society, so we make sure 10 years from now, we have a much better future than present.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Mahan, for including me in your podcast. And it's really lovely to connect with other leaders who are doing like work, right? Where we share a mission for the world to be led better in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Henna Inam.
Thank you.